My husband announced our divorce at my own birthday party. Not quietly, not privately, not after the cake, not with any mercy at all. He stood up in front of 43 people, my mother included, raised his glass, and said he had something to tell everyone before the night went any further. I remember the way the room went still. I remember thinking he was going to say something sweet. Then he spoke, and I understood that the only person in the room who already knew was standing in the kitchen doorway, arms folded, barefoot because she had made herself at home years ago. That woman was his sister, and she drove me home that night without a single word. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. The birthday party was at our house. Luca had insisted on that. He had spent 2 weeks planning it with the particular enthusiasm of a man who wanted everyone in the room to see how well he took care of his wife. Flowers from the place on Alderton Street that required a pre-order. A cake from the bakery on Meridian with my name written in a shade of gold that someone had specifically selected. 43 guests, which was more than I had wanted, but Luca had a large family and a larger social orbit, and I had learned over 5 years of marriage that our home had a way of filling up according to his design rather than mine. I had taken my heels off at 9 o'clock. This is the detail I come back to sometimes, the specific ordinary comfort of setting my heels beside the kitchen island and standing barefoot on the cool tile, a glass of wine in hand, laughing at something my college friend Dara said about the connecting flight she had nearly missed to get here. I remember thinking, this is nice. I remember thinking, this is what a birthday feels like when someone who loves you puts genuine thought into it. I did not know, standing barefoot in my own kitchen, that the thought Luca had put into the evening had nothing to do with love. Thea was in the kitchen doorway. She was almost always in the kitchen doorway at these gatherings, which was such a specific and consistent thing about her that I had stopped registering it as anything other than Thea being Thea. Dorothea Hale did not circulate at parties the way her brother did. She arrived, she helped set up whatever needed setting up, she found the edge of a room and occupied it with the particular self-possession of someone who had made peace, a long time ago, with needing exactly this much of the social world and not a single unit more. She had a glass of water. She was wearing dark jeans and a cream-colored shirt, and she had taken her own shoes off at some point, which I noticed only because her feet were quiet on the kitchen tile and I tracked the sounds in my own house the way you track sounds in spaces you know completely. Thea was 34 years old. She was 3 years older than Luca and approximately 40 years older than him in every way that mattered. She was an architectural consultant who worked mostly with heritage buildings, post offices, and courthouses, and century-old facades that required a careful hand to restore without losing what made them true. It was work that suited her in the way that some work suits some people so precisely you cannot imagine them doing anything else. She had the patience for things that required attention over long periods of time, the willingness to understand a structure completely before deciding what it could and could not carry. She had dark hair she kept at a length that was practical rather than considered, and eyes that were a gray-brown I had never found the right word for, and she was not beautiful in the way that announced itself across rooms. She was beautiful in the way that stayed with you after you left the room, a gradual accumulation, the kind you noticed more the longer you knew her. I had known her for 6 years. 2 years of Luca and I dating, 5 years of marriage. 7 years total of Thea at the periphery of my life, the steady presence at every family gathering, the one who called to check in when I mentioned a work deadline was pressing, the one who had appeared with soup the one time I was genuinely sick and Luca was traveling, who knew without being told how I took my coffee, who understood when to talk and when to let a silence be something other than empty. I had not examined any of this too closely. Luca stood up at 10:17. I know the exact time because I had checked my phone at 10:15 to text Dara's husband about her flight the following morning, and when I looked up, Luca was on his feet with his glass raised and his face arranged in the particular expression he used for public moments: warm, self-aware, slightly too conscious of an audience. "Everyone," he said. "If I could have a moment." The room settled. 43 people turning, the particular shift of a gathering that understands something deliberate is coming. I thought, he is going to say something about the marriage. Something public and slightly embarrassing, and full of the easy sentiment he was good at. The anniversary-adjacent speech. The "look how far we have come." I set my wine glass down and prepared to be mildly mortified in the affectionate way. I was correct that it was going to be about the marriage. Luca said, "I want to be honest with everyone here, because the people in this room are people we love, and I have always believed that honesty at the beginning of something is better than silence at the end." The room did not know yet what was beginning. I looked at his face. He said, "Clem and I have decided to separate. We wanted you all to hear it from us, together, here, Because that is the kind of people we want to be. The wine glass I had just set down was very close to my hand. The tile was smooth under my bare feet. My mother, across the room, looked at me with an expression I will not try to describe because some expressions belong entirely to the person who made them. 43 people were very still. I said nothing. Something had happened to the language I usually lived in. I stood there with my bare feet and my birthday and my marriage announcing itself as a thing that was ending in front of everyone who had come to celebrate it beginning another year, and the only thing I registered clearly in that moment was movement in the kitchen doorway. Thea had pushed herself off the doorframe. She crossed the room. Not toward Luca. Toward me. She stopped beside me. She did not say anything. She did not touch me. She simply stood there, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her shoulder beside mine, and did not move. Luca continued, something about mutual respect and timing and the hope that everyone would honor both of them through the transition. The words moved past me without landing. I was aware of my bare feet on the tile. I was aware of Thea's shoulder. I was aware of my mother's face beginning to reassemble itself into something functional. People began moving toward me. My mother, Dara, 3 or 4 others who filled space with proximity, when they did not know what else to offer. The gathering began to dissolve in the way gatherings dissolve when an event has made staying feel complicated quietly, carefully, in ones and twos, each departure a small act of mercy. Luca disappeared. Into the study, I assumed, or the back garden. He had said the thing he had come to say. Thea appeared at my elbow with my shoes. I looked at the heels. Then at her face. You don't have to put them on, she said. I'll carry them. I don't want to stay here, I said. It was the first real sentence I had managed in 40 minutes. Then don't, she said. Come on. She picked up my coat from the hook near the door. She picked up her bag. She held the door open and I walked through it and down the front steps in my bare feet onto the cold pavement and did not look back at the lit windows or the remaining sounds inside the house that had been ours. Thea's car was 2 houses down. She unlocked it without making anything of it. I got in. She put my heels on the back seat. She started the engine and pulled into the street and said nothing at all. I watched the neighborhood scroll past the window, the lit houses and the ordinary late-night quiet of a Saturday in a suburb that had not heard the announcement that had just been made in the house we had left. She drove for 20 minutes without speaking. When she pulled up outside her building, I looked at the entrance and then at her. You don't have to explain anything, she said. You can sleep in the spare room and eat whatever is in the kitchen and leave whenever you're ready. She got out of the car. I sat for one more moment, the cold of the seat, the quiet engine, the particular feeling of being at the end of something and having no clear sense yet of what was on the other side. Then I got out too. Thea's apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that had been something industrial once and had been converted carefully by people who had respected what it used to be. High ceilings. Exposed beams that had been sealed rather than stripped. A wall of east-facing windows that I knew from the one time I had been here before let in very good morning light. She had a sofa, the color of old moss and bookshelves along the full length of one wall and a kitchen that was narrow but organized with the precision of someone who cooked seriously and kept nothing she did not use. The apartment smelled of cedar and something faintly floral, and under that the quiet, neutral warmth of a space that was genuinely lived in. She moved through the kitchen without asking what I wanted. Kettle. Toast. A glass of water set in my direction. She produced good cheese from somewhere and a small bowl of fig preserve and arranged them on the counter with the focused care of someone who understood that this particular kind of broken needed feeding before it needed anything else. I sat on one of the stools. The tile was cool under my bare feet. I stared at them. 5 years, I said. I know, she said. She was not looking at me. She was slicing. Her hands were steady. Did you know, I asked, that he was going to do it tonight? She was quiet for a moment. Not specifically, she said. Not like this. What did you know? She considered the answer in the careful way she considered everything. That he wasn't happy, she said. That you weren't either, maybe. That the two of you had become, she paused, adjacent to each other, for a while. Adjacent. It was the exact right word. The word for what 5 years had quietly become without either of us naming it, 2 people occupying the same space, the same events, the same social life, without quite touching at the center. He did it at my birthday party, I said. She looked at me then. Something moved across her face that she did not entirely contain. I know, she said. That was not the way to do it. I ate the toast. Not because I was hungry, but because my body needed something to do, and she had made it specifically for me, and that felt like the most important fact in the room. I stayed for 3 days. The first day I slept for 11 hours and answered only Dara and my mother by text, short and honest. I'm fine. I'm not at the house. I'll call tomorrow. My mother called twice. I called her back in the evening and let her say everything and said very little myself. Thea moved around the apartment around me like water around a stone present, continuous, adjusted to the shape of me without requiring anything in return. She worked from home. I had known this but never seen it in practice. She worked from the big table by the east windows, with architectural drawings spread out and her laptop open and her coffee going cold beside her, in the specific way of someone so absorbed in the problem that physical comfort becomes secondary. On the second morning, I came out of the spare room at 7 and found her already at the table, the east light coming through the windows in long, warm bars across the floor. She looked up when I appeared. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," I said. She gestured toward the kitchen. I made coffee and stood for a moment, looking at the drawings spread across her table. Detailed elevations of a facade, every line precise, every proportion accounted for. "What is this?" I asked. "A post office on Harrow Street," she said. 1,887. The developers want to convert the upper floors. We're arguing that the original windows are load-bearing in ways that matter to the whole structure. "Load-bearing," I repeated. She looked up at me briefly. "Yes, some things that appear decorative are actually structural. Remove them and the whole thing shifts in ways you cannot anticipate." I sat down across from her with my coffee. She went back to her drawing. We were quiet for a long time, and it was the kind of silence that is not uncomfortable but full, the kind you only have with people you have known long enough that silence is its own language rather than the absence of one. My phone buzzed on the table. I looked at it. Luca's name. I set it face down. Thea's pencil didn't stop moving. "I don't want to talk to him yet," I said. "You don't have to," she said. "He's going to want to do it properly. Lawyers, paperwork, the furniture question. That will exist when you're ready for it. It doesn't have to exist today." I looked at the drawings. "I didn't know I was unhappy," I said. "Or I did, in the way you know the water is cold before you put your hand in it, but you keep your hand near it anyway." The pencil paused, then moved again. 5 years is a long time to keep your hand near cold water," she said. "I know." "When did it start?" she asked. "Being cold." A real question. I sat with it. "A while ago," I said. "A while ago it stopped being a marriage and became a domestic arrangement. An organization. We managed things together very efficiently." "Adjacent," she said without looking up. "Yes, that." She set the pencil down and looked at me across the drawings. In the east light, she looked very much like herself, the clear gray-brown eyes, the steady attention that she brought to things she had decided were worth understanding. "I'm going to need a lawyer," I said. "I know someone good. I'll text you her name." She went back to her drawing. I finished my coffee and did not say anything else, and it was enough, which told me something I was not ready to examine yet. On the third day, I called the lawyer, a woman named Petra Calloway who practiced family law on the North Side and had a voice on the phone that was crisp and entirely unsentimental in a way I found more comforting than warmth would have been. She gave me a document list, a framework, a timeline. I hung up and sat on Thea's sofa and stared at the wall. Thea appeared from the kitchen with 2 mugs and sat at the other end of the sofa, far enough to be respectful, close enough to be present. She tucked her feet under her the way she did when she had settled into a space and intended to stay. "How was she?" she asked. "Brutal in the useful way," I said. "Good. That's what this requires." I looked at the framed print on the wall opposite me, an architectural cross-section drawing, a stairwell rendered in precise ink, each landing proportioned, the interior logic of the structure made visible as if the outer wall had been removed. "I have to go back to the house," I said. "I know. I don't want to." "I know. Would you?" I stopped. It was too much to ask. She had already given 3 days and a spare room and her coffee and the drawer space she had cleared without being asked. "Yes," she said. I hadn't finished the sentence. "Yes," she said again, looking at the cross-section print. "I'll come with you." I looked at her. The profile. The jaw set with a stillness that was not absence but effort. She said, "When you're ready." "Not yet," I said. "Not yet," she agreed. We sat on the sofa with our mugs in the morning light, and neither of us said anything for a long time, and the silence had a weight to it, the texture of everything neither of us was saying, the way very cold air has texture even when nothing is moving. I left on the 3rd afternoon. I borrowed a pair of her socks because my heels were still in the back of her car and I was not going to walk into my building barefoot. The socks were too large and enormously comfortable, and I said neither of these things. She drove me to the apartment, the one I had sublet for the past 5 years, the one I had kept in my name throughout the marriage as a quiet insurance I had not examined closely. I understood, standing in the entrance for the first time in a year, that some part of me had been maintaining an exit without telling the rest of me it was doing so. Outside the building, she kept the engine running. I did not get out immediately. "Thea," I said. "Yes?" "Thank you. For the soup when Luca traveled. For the birthday. For the 3 days." She looked at me, gray-brown eyes in the afternoon light. "Of course," she said. "That's not an answer to what I'm actually saying," I said. A pause. The engine idled. "I know," she said. "What is?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment in the particular way she was quiet when she was measuring what was true against what was timely. "I don't think right now is when I answer that," she said. I looked at her, really looked at her, the woman who had been on the edge of every room I had shared with her family for 7 years. Soup and lawyers and birthday parties and spare rooms and socks that were too large and fit perfectly anyway. "You're protecting me," I said. "I'm protecting both of us," she said. "There's a version of this conversation that goes badly because the timing is wrong, and I'm not willing to have that version." Her hands were on the wheel. Still. "Will you tell me eventually?" I asked. "Yes," she said. "When?" "When you're actually ready and not just hurting," she said. "There's a difference. I need you to be the first thing." I stared at her. She held my gaze. I said, "I didn't know you were doing this." "I know," she said. "All this time," I said. "Yes." I got out of the car. I stood on the pavement. She sat in the idling car. We looked at each other through the glass for one moment that was its own kind of full. Then I went inside. The apartment smelled like someone else's life. The sublease tenant had been tidy, careful, respectful of a space that was not entirely hers, and the rooms were clean and small and dense with the person I had been before the marriage. And standing in the middle of the living room in borrowed socks, I understood with a strange clarity that I had been subletting my own self for approximately 5 years and was now, with no particular readiness and no real choice, back in residence. I spent 4 days answering messages in order of what I could tolerate. Dara first, my mother, colleagues, the peripheral social contacts who had been at the party and sent careful notes that were really questions wrapped in sympathy. Luca texted twice. I read both. I replied to neither. Petra Calloway had told me all formal correspondence could go through her office, and I said yes, please, and meant it absolutely. On the 5th morning, I went running for the first time since the party. The city was doing its ordinary weekday things. Coffee lines and dog walkers and buses and the particular indifferent energy of a neighborhood that had not heard any announcement about my marriage and did not require anything from me. I ran for 40 minutes and felt, at the end of it, not healed, not even close to healed, but moving. Which was something. Thea texted on the 6th day. A link to a Heritage Board article about the post office on Harrow Street. A local preservation group had formally endorsed the case for the original windows. Her note said, "We might win this one." I read it twice. I wrote back, "Good. Those windows sound load-bearing." She replied with a single period, which from Thea was the equivalent of a full smile. I started to notice things. This was the beginning of the problem. Or the beginning of the thing I could not keep pretending was not a thing. I had been in enough of my own life to understand the difference between recovery and reckoning, between the relief of having someone steady near you and the particular alert awareness that had a different name entirely. I had been with men before Luca, and I had, once, briefly, been with a woman in the last year of university, a sculptor named Bet, who smelled like clay and turpentine and who had looked at me across a studio critique with such direct and unhurried attention that I had spent a week afterward pretending it was nothing before I stopped pretending. Bet and I had not lasted. She moved to Edinburgh for a residency, and I moved into the professional life that was waiting, and neither of us had been the kind of person who maintained things across distances. But I had never filed the experience away as a mistake. I had filed it as something real, and then let life build up around it without ever opening that particular drawer again. I was opening it now. Not because of Betty. Because of Thea at her drawing table with the east light across her jaw and her pencil moving across the elevation with that patient, accountable precision. Because of the way she had said load-bearing windows with a half-beat of something that contained more than it showed. Because of the socks borrowed, too large, left on the edge of the spare room bed without being asked. The way you leave things for a person you have been paying close enough attention to know they will need it before they know themselves. When I thought about the birthday party, what I returned to was not Luca's voice or my mother's face or the 43 people in the room. It was Thea in the kitchen doorway, the warmth of her shoulder beside mine when the room went still. The way she appeared with my shoes and did not make it a production. When I thought about the 3 days at her apartment, the images that surfaced were not the spare room or the lawyer's number or the sofa. They were the east light across her jaw in the morning, the way she held her coffee with both hands, the pencil moving across the elevation drawings. When her name appeared on my phone, I felt something that was not casual warmth. It was more specific than that, more directional. The particular attention of a person who has begun tracking something without having made the decision to track it. I had been married to a man for 5 years, and I was 31 years old, and I was noticing the exact way Thea Hale held her coffee cup, and this was information I needed to do something with. I sat with it for 4 days. Then I stopped sitting with it and called her instead. She answered on the second ring, which told me something. Thea was not a fast answerer. She answered when she had assessed that answering was the right choice. I said, "Are you free tonight?" The pause lasted exactly as long as a considered answer takes. "Yes," she said. "Come to mine. I'll cook." She cooked something with white wine and lemon and herbs from the small terracotta pot on her windowsill that I noticed specifically this time where I had only noticed it peripherally before. The apartment was warm and smelled of the cooking and the cedar and something underneath that was simply her, and I was apparently now cataloging that too. We ate at the table by the east windows. She had moved the drawings aside and set it simply 2 plates, 2 glasses, a candle that was practical rather than romantic and was a candle nonetheless. She poured wine. She sat across from me. "How's the post office?" I asked. "We have a meeting with the planning office next week," she said. "The preservation group's support gives us formal standing, not guaranteed. But the argument is stronger now." "Load-bearing windows," I said. "Load-bearing windows," she agreed. We ate. The city moved outside the glass. The candle threw warm light across the table and across her face, which I was now looking at with a quality of attention I was only recently beginning to understand was specific to her and had probably always been. After dinner, we moved to the sofa with the wine. She sat at her end, feet tucked under her. I sat closer than the 3rd day, not touching, aware of the distance between us in the way you are aware of the space just before something fills it. "I've been thinking about something," I said. "Tell me." "What you said in the car. About the conversation you won't have yet. About timing." She was still. "I understand why you said it," I said. "I understand what you were protecting." "Good," she said. "I want you to know that I'm not looking for something to hold on to because everything fell apart. I'm looking at something specific. Something that I think has been here longer than I've been paying attention to it, and I can tell the difference." She set her wine glass down very deliberately. She turned to face me fully. She said, "I believe you. And I want to tell you something." "Please," I said. She said, "I have been in love with you for a very long time, since before you married Luca. I knew it the night he brought you to the first family dinner, and I watched you make my mother laugh with a story about your first job, and I thought, there she is. That's the person." The room held that. She said, "I chose not to act on it because you were with my brother, and because I don't do that, and because I would rather have you at the edge of my life than not in it at all." I stared at her. She said, "And then the party happened, and I drove you home, and you stayed 3 days, and you called me on the 10th day. And now you are sitting on my sofa telling me you can tell the difference between reaching for comfort and seeing something real." "Yes," I said. She said, "I need you to be certain, not to protect myself, to protect you. Because I have been holding this very carefully for a long time, and when I stop holding it carefully, I won't be able to take it back." I said, "I've been holding something too. I just didn't have a name for it until recently." She looked at me for a long moment. The candle had burned down. The city outside had gone quieter. "I'm not going to do this tonight," she said. I went still. She said, "Not because I don't want to. Because you are 10 days from the worst public moment of your life, and I want every part of what happens between us to be something you can look at clearly in 6 months and know was real and chosen, not just a response to the pain. That is the most protective thing anyone has ever said to me," I said. "I know it doesn't feel like what you want right now." "It doesn't," I said. "I know," she said. The city hummed outside. I sat very still and felt the shape of what she had said settle into the room like something finding its right weight. She said, "But Clem, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. When the dust settles and you have had time to actually know what you want, I will still be here. That is the most honest promise I know how to make." I looked at her. The gray-brown eyes and the careful mouth and the hands folded in her lap with a stillness that was not absence but effort. 4 years of this," she had said. 4 years of soup and spare rooms and knowledge of how I took my coffee and appearing in kitchen doorways without ever once crossing the room toward something she wanted. "How long?" I said. "Specifically." She said, 4 years, give or take. I sat with that. 4 years. Since before the marriage was what it had become, since before I had started keeping my hand near cold water and calling it contentment. Thea, I said. Yes? You are going to have to let me know when enough time has passed, I said. Because I don't trust myself to measure it right now. She said, I'll know. How? Because, she said, you're going to stop looking like you're trying to decide if what you're feeling is real and start looking like someone who already knows. I looked at her across the sofa in the low light of a candle that had almost finished. What do I look like right now? I asked. She looked at me for a long and careful moment. Like you're almost there, she said. I went home with her socks and the wine still warm in my chest and the weight of everything she had said and not said, and I sat in my apartment with all its borrowed quiet and felt more present in my own body than I had in a very long time. Almost there, she had said. I thought about the east light across her jaw, the pencil on the drawing, load-bearing windows. Someone should show up. I thought about 4 years of careful, deliberate, completely unannounced love for a woman who had not been looking. I was looking now, and I sat in the apartment in her socks and the dark and the particular feeling of something beginning rather than ending, and for the first time since my birthday, the thing filling the room was not grief. The socks were still on my feet when I woke up the next morning. I had fallen asleep in them, which I had not done since university, and I lay for a long moment in the gray early light of my apartment and looked at the ceiling and took stock of everything I was feeling with the careful, methodical attention of someone who had learned, somewhere in the middle of the night, that the feelings would not organize themselves unless she helped them. I was not grieving. That was the first thing I established. I had expected to be. Had braced for the specific weight of 5 years announcing their end, but what I found instead was something more complex and harder to name, the particular state that follows a long-delayed honest reckoning, which is not grief, but is adjacent to it in the way that hunger is adjacent to the ache of having been hungry for too long. I was, underneath everything, relieved. And underneath the relief, I was afraid of the relief, because relief implied that the marriage had been wrong for a long time and I had been choosing not to know it, and that was the kind of self-knowledge that required a morning to sit with before it could be carried without being dropped. I made coffee. I stood at the window in Thea's socks and the pale light of an October morning in a city that did not know or care what had happened in a suburban house the previous week, and I drank the coffee and let the relief exist without apologizing for it. Then I thought about what Thea had said. Almost there. I turned it over. The specific phrasing of it. Not quite there yet, but almost. She had looked at me with those gray-brown eyes and measured me the way she measured everything, the load-bearing structures, the hidden supports, the things that looked decorative but were actually holding something important up. And she had told me I was almost to the place where what I was feeling was finally what I actually felt, rather than what I felt in response to what had happened. She was right. She was, as she tended to be about the things she looked at carefully, correct. I went for a run at 7. Long, through the park and along the water and back through the streets that were only starting to fill with the day. I ran for 50 minutes and came back and stood in the shower and thought about nothing at all, which was itself a kind of progress. The running was something I had done sporadically through the marriage and had let slip in the final year, when the domestic architecture of 2 people managing an ending had quietly consumed the hours I used to spend on the simpler business of moving through the world and being a body in it. Taking it back felt like reclaiming something specific and necessary. Thea texted at 9:15. Not about anything important. A photograph of the east window in her apartment, the morning light across the drawing table, the cold coffee in its usual position. The note said, "The planning office confirmed the meeting. Thursday." I wrote back, "You're going to win this." She wrote, "The windows are load-bearing, it just took some people longer to see it." I sat with the phone in my hands for a long time. I did not analyze the message. I had learned, in the preceding 10 days, that analyzing Thea's messages was a way of delaying the larger work of simply knowing her, which was a different and more demanding project. I set the phone face up on the counter, went to my desk, and started the workday. The work was good. I was a structural project manager for a mid-sized design firm, which was the kind of job that existed in the useful overlap between orderly thinking and the specific satisfaction of watching something complex resolve into its correct form. I had been good at it for 7 years, and the goodness had not diminished, which was one of the things I was grateful for, that the marriage's quiet erosion had been contained to the marriage rather than spreading outward into everything else I was. The people in my office had been careful with me in the first weeks back, slightly softer than usual, the way colleagues are when a personal fact becomes professionally known and nobody is quite sure what the etiquette requires. I appreciated the care and was glad when it gradually gave way to the ordinary texture of working alongside people who respected you enough to treat you normally. My director said in a conversation I had not expected, "Whatever is happening at home, your work has not suffered." And then she moved on to the project timeline and did not mention it again, which was exactly the correct thing to do. I told Thea about a difficult meeting with Priya at Thursday dinner one week in November. She asked the right questions, not about the emotional layer, but about the technical problem, the load tolerance disagreement, the resolution Priya and I had reached. She listened with the focused interest she brought to structural problems of all kinds, and when I finished, she said, "You love that job." "I do," I said. "It shows," she said. "When you talk about it, your sentences get more specific. Your vocabulary shifts into a different register." I said, "Is that how you know when someone loves something?" She said, "That's how I know when you love something." I sat with that. The specific knowledge of how I expressed what I loved, accumulated over years of paying attention in kitchen doorways, across drawing tables, at family dinners, in the amber light of a restaurant with the corner table and a carafe of red wine. She had been building a vocabulary for me the whole time. Not to use as leverage. Not to hold in reserve. Because she was the kind of person who learned the things she cared about completely and held the learning carefully, waiting for the moment when the holding could become something else. I said, "You've been paying very close attention." She said, "Yes." I said, "For a long time." She said, "Yes." I said, "What did you do with all of it?" She looked at the wine, then at me. She said, "I held it, and I waited." I said, "That's an extraordinary amount of patience." She said quietly, "You're worth an extraordinary amount of patience." I knew that from the first dinner. I knew it from the first 20 minutes. I sat with that for the rest of the dinner and the walk out and the drive home and most of the following day. I sat with that. The specific knowledge of how I expressed what I loved, accumulated over years of paying attention in kitchen doorways and across drawing tables and at family dinners. My current project was in the planning stages of a mixed-use development in the east end of the city for a mid-sized design firm, which was the kind of job that existed in the useful overlap between orderly thinking and the specific satisfaction of watching something complex resolve into its correct form. I had been good at it for 7 years, and the goodness had not diminished, which was one of the things I was grateful for, that the marriage's quiet erosion had been contained to the marriage, rather than spreading outward into everything else I was. The people in my office had been careful with me in the first weeks back, slightly softer than usual, the way colleagues are when a personal fact becomes professionally known and nobody is quite sure what the etiquette requires. I appreciated the care and was glad when it gradually gave way to the ordinary texture of working alongside people who respected you enough to treat you normally. My director said, in a conversation I had not expected, "Whatever is happening at home, your work has not suffered." And then she moved on to the project timeline and did not mention it again, which was exactly the correct thing to do. My current project was in the planning stages of a mixed-use development in the east end of the city, which required the kind of detailed coordination between structural consultants and the architectural team that I found genuinely engaging. I had a colleague named Priya who was the lead architect on the project, a meticulous and slightly combative woman who argued with me over load tolerances in a way I had come to value, because the arguing always resolved into something better than either of us had started with. I called Petra Calloway at 11. She had already received a response from Luca's attorney, which she summarized with the crisp efficiency of someone who had been doing this work for 20 years and had seen every version of it. "The house is the largest asset," she said. "He would like to buy out your share." I had not anticipated that. I had assumed we would sell it, split the proceeds, move on. "His family has money," I said. "His family has money," Petra confirmed. "The figure they've proposed is fair. Actually above fair, if you want my read on it." I thought about the house. The kitchen with the island where I had stood barefoot at 9 o'clock and thought, "This is nice." The back garden that Luca had designed and I had never had strong feelings about. The bedroom I had slept in for 5 years without ever feeling entirely certain it was where I was supposed to be. The wardrobe that had always held his things on the left and mine on the right with a careful intermediate space that neither of us had thought of as symbolic until now. "Tell them yes," I said. She made a note. "That's the cleanest path," she said. "You'll have capital. You'll be free of the property, and the process will move faster." "Good," I said. "I want it to move faster." She said, "How are you doing?" And it was not a practiced question. It had the cadence of someone who had watched enough of these processes to understand that the legal clarity was sometimes the easiest part. I said, "Better than I expected." "Honestly, that's common," she said. Sometimes the announcement is the hardest part because it's the part you didn't choose. Everything after, you choose. I sat with that for a moment after we hung up. Everything after, you choose. I wrote it on a sticky note and put it on the corner of my monitor and left it there for the rest of the autumn. There was a day, toward the end of October, when I had to return to the house. Not because I wanted to, I had made it clear through Petra that I preferred all coordination to happen through the lawyers. But there was a box of my grandmother's things in the study closet. 3 framed photographs and a small wooden box containing letters, and a blue ceramic bowl I had used every morning as a child at my grandmother's kitchen table and had brought into the marriage the way you bring the things that are too important to leave in storage. They were mine specifically, nothing Luca had ever claimed or wanted. But they were not the kind of things I could ask someone else to retrieve. Thea came with me. I had not asked her to. I had mentioned on a Thursday that I was going to have to go back to collect a few things, and she had said, "Tell me when." And when I sent her the day and the time, she appeared at my building at 8 in the morning with coffee in 2 cups and no particular commentary. We drove in her car. She did not make conversation about the errand. She played something quiet and instrumental on the stereo and drove with the easy attention she brought to everything, and I sat in the passenger seat and watched the city change from my neighborhood to the neighborhood that used to be ours. The house was empty. The key still worked, which felt strange, and then it felt like the last day of a rental agreement, which was more accurate. The study closet was where I had left everything. The 3 photographs and the wooden box and the blue bowl, still wrapped in a dishcloth I had placed around it years ago, and had always meant to replace with proper packaging material and had never gotten around to. I lifted it carefully. The bowl was the right weight in my hands, the weight of a thing you have known since childhood, which is a specific and irreplaceable weight. Thea was in the doorway. She said, "Is that everything?" I looked around the study. Luca's books on the shelves, which I had never read, the desk that had always been his, the one chair I had liked, a worn green thing he had wanted to replace, and I had kept finding reasons to keep. "Yes," I said. "That's everything." She carried the box with the photographs. I carried the bowl and the letters. We walked out and she locked the door behind us and we put everything in the back of her car and she drove away and I did not look back. On the drive, she said, "Are you all right?" I thought about it honestly. "It didn't hurt the way I expected," I said. "I thought it would feel like leaving something behind. It felt more like setting something down." She said, "That's usually what it means when a place stops being home before you actually move out of it." I looked at her profile in the car. The clean line of her jaw, the particular way she held the steering wheel with both hands, the quality of her attention. "When did it stop?" I asked. She said, "I don't know. You probably know better than I do." I thought about it. I said, "Gradually. And then all at once. The way those things go." She nodded. She said, "The bowl is beautiful." I said, "It was my grandmother's. We ate breakfast from it every morning when I visited as a child. Oatmeal, mostly. She had a specific way she stirred it." Thea said, "What way?" "Counterclockwise," I said. "Always." I never asked her why. I thought I would have more mornings to ask in. Then there weren't any more mornings. A silence. The kind that holds something carefully without breaking it. Thea said, "I'm glad you have it." I said, "Me too." We went back to my apartment and I put the bowl on the kitchen windowsill, which was the natural place for it. Thea put the photographs on the table and looked at them without touching. She said, "Which one is your grandmother?" "The middle one," I said. "The birthday party." She looked at it for a long time. "She looks like she found everything funny," Thea said. "She did," I said. "Almost everything. She had very precise standards for what qualified." We made tea and sat at the table and I told her about my grandmother, which I had not talked about with anyone in a long time. Not because the loss was still sharp, she had been gone for 9 years, but because the memories were mine in a specific way and I had been selective about who I shared them with. The blue bowl, the counterclockwise stirring, the way she laughed at things most people thought were serious, the garden she kept with the same organized attention I recognized now in myself and understood as inheritance rather than coincidence. The way she made tea, exact steep time, exact temperature, the leaves always loose and never bagged, because she said bagged tea was what you drank when you did not care about the outcome. I had thought of this as eccentricity when I was young and had understood it as a philosophy of attention when I was older. Thea listened with complete attention. She asked questions at the right intervals, the kind that opened rather than redirected. When I finished, she said, "You have her eyes. In the photograph, the color is the same." I looked at the photograph. I said, "No one has ever told me that." She said, "I've been looking at the photograph for 20 minutes. I looked at her. She was looking at it still, with the focused attention she brought to things she was invested in, understanding completely. I said, "You notice things about me." She said, "I have been noticing things about you for a long time." I said, "I know." I didn't know I was noticing them back. She looked at me then. Something in her face she did not compose before I could see it. She said, "I know that too," which I had not done with anyone in a long time. Not because the loss was still sharp, she had been gone for 9 years, but because the memories were mine in a specific way and I had been selective about who I shared them with. The blue bowl, the counterclockwise stirring, the way she laughed at things most people thought were serious, the garden she kept with the same organized attention I recognized now in myself, and understood as inheritance rather than coincidence. Thea listened with complete attention. She asked questions at the right intervals, the kind that opened rather than redirected. When I finished, she said, "You have her eyes. In the photograph, the color is the same." I looked at the photograph. I said, "No one has ever told me that." She said, "I've been looking at the photograph for 20 minutes. I looked at her. She was looking at the photograph still, with the focused attention she brought to things she was interested in understanding completely. I said, "You notice things about me." She said, "I have been noticing things about you for a long time." I said, "I know." I didn't know I was noticing them back. She looked at me then, something in her face that she did not compose before I could see it. She said, "I know that too." The weeks progressed in their new shape. Thea won the planning meeting on a Thursday. I knew because she sent me a photograph of the post office facade at 11:40 in the morning with a single line, "Load-bearing, confirmed." I texted back, "Dinner. You choose where." She chose a place I had not been to, a small restaurant, on a street of small restaurants that is the kind of place that exists in every city and is only findable if someone who knows what they're looking for shows it to you. It was warm inside and smelled of garlic and wine and the specific amber of good low lighting, and Thea was already there when I arrived. At a corner table with her jacket over the chair back and a glass of red wine in front of her and her reading glasses still on her face from whatever she had been reviewing before I walked in. She looked up when I came in. She took the glasses off, put them in her jacket pocket. "You look different," she said. "I feel different," I said. "More like accurate. More like myself." She poured me wine from the carafe she had already ordered. "Tell me about the planning meeting," I said. "All of it," she told me. She was precise and almost quietly happy about it. In the contained way, she was happy about things she had worked for long enough that the outcome felt both earned and slightly surreal. The Heritage Group had presented the structural analysis. The planning officer had initially been skeptical, but Thea had been prepared for the skepticism and had laid out the load-bearing argument with a patience and specificity that had, over the course of 2 hours, simply worn down the objection until there was no ground left for it to stand on. The windows would stay. The conversion would proceed in a way that respected what the building was before it became what it was going to be. "You should be proud," I said. She looked at the wine. "I am," she said, quietly. She was always quietly anything. It was one of the things I had been cataloging since the birthday, though I understood now I had been cataloging it for much longer, for years. In the portion of my attention that had always been tracking her without telling the rest of me it was doing so. I said, "I talked to Priya this week about load tolerances." She looked up. "My colleague on the East End project," I said. "We were arguing about whether the existing foundation can carry an additional floor they want to add. The issue is load distribution. The design currently isn't accounting for it the right way." She said, "Send me the drawings." I stared at her. She said, "It's not overstepping. Structural consultation is what I do. Yours is a structural problem. I'll look at the foundation specifications." I said, "You'd consult on my project." She said, "I'd consult on any project where the question is interesting. Yours is interesting." I said, "Because of the foundation problem?" She looked at me steadily. Her expression said that the foundation was not exclusively what she was referring to. I said, "Thank you." She said, "Send me the drawings." I sent them that night. She sent back a 3-page annotated document by Friday morning. Priya read it with the focused appreciation of someone who recognized technical competence regardless of its source. "Who is this?" Priya asked. "An architectural consultant," I said. "Heritage buildings mostly. She has extraordinary instincts on transfer loads," Priya said. "Is she available for a formal consultation?" I said, "I'll ask." I mentioned it to Thea at Thursday dinner and she said, "Of course," and that was that. Which was how Thea came to sit in our office conference room on a Tuesday afternoon, precise and thorough and entirely in command of the technical argument, and how Priya, at the end of the meeting, shook her hand and said, "You explained the problem in a way that made the solution obvious." And Thea said, "The solution was always there. It just needed the right frame." I walked her out afterward. In the lobby, she put her coat on and I stood close enough to smell the cedar of it, and she looked at me with those gray-brown eyes and said, "Good project." I said, "Good consultation." She said, "I'll invoice you properly." I said, "Absolutely not." She said, "Clem." I said, "Thea." A pause. The lobby humming around us. She said, "I'll send Priya the invoice." And she left. I stood in the lobby watching her go and understood that the careful line she maintained between the person who loved me and the person conducting herself appropriately in every context was costing her something specific every single time. She drew it. Luca's mother called me on a Wednesday in early November. Hilda Hale was 71 years old and had built her sense of the world around the conviction that family required active maintenance. She had been genuinely warm to me throughout the marriage, not performatively, not as an extension of Luca, but as herself, in the direct and interested way of a woman who decided whether she liked someone on her own terms and acted accordingly. "Clementine," she said, using my full name the way she always had, "I've been thinking about you." "I've been thinking about you too," I said, which was true. "I want you to know," she said, "that I am not calling to assign blame or manage how you feel about what happened. I'm calling because I love you, and I have loved you for 6 years, and I don't want to lose you from my life because the marriage has ended. That is not how I understand family to work." I sat down. "That is very generous," I said. "It is not generous," she said. "It is what is true. You have been part of this family for 6 years, and that doesn't end because a marriage does. I don't operate that way." I was quiet for a moment. She said, "I know Thea has been looking after you." "Yes," I said. "She is good at that," Hilda said. "She has always been the one who looks after everyone, since she was very young, before anyone asked her to. I have sometimes wondered if anyone looks after her with the same thoroughness. I have tried. She accepts it with the full consideration that she gives everything, and then continues exactly as she was." I laughed despite myself. "She is consistent," I said. "She is extremely consistent," Hilda said, with the warmth of a woman who had been watching the consistency for 3 decades and was both proud of and gently exasperated by it. "I just wonder sometimes if anyone tells her that consistency doesn't mean she goes without the things she wants." The sentence sat in the air on the phone line between us. I said, "She doesn't go without. She is very careful about the things she chooses to keep near." Hilda was quiet for a moment. "Then, dinner, Clementine, before the year ends. Just the 2 of us, or with Thea if that makes it easier." I said, "I'd like that." "Good," she said. "That's settled." She called Thea the same day, I learned later. Thea mentioned it at the following Thursday dinner with the brief, understated observation that her mother was a more sophisticated operator than anyone gave her credit for. "She likes you," Thea said. "I like her," I said. "She would like you regardless of Luca," Thea said. "She has always been that way. The people who come into the family through the official channels sometimes get to stay on their own merits." "And what do I stay on?" I asked. Thea looked at her wine, then at me. "Your own merits," she said. "Obviously." "Obviously," I repeated, holding the word for a moment, aware of everything packed inside it. She did not look away. The weeks continued. There was a Saturday morning when Thea came to return a book I had lent her. She had read it in 6 days, which I had expected, and arrived at my door with the book under her arm and a bag from the bakery 2 streets down. She had planned the visit to include breakfast, which meant she had thought about what I ate in the morning, which meant she had been thinking about my mornings. I stood in my doorway in soft old Saturday clothes, and she looked at me and held up the bakery bag and said, "Good book." I said, "Which part?" She said, "The last chapter. The thing about the difference between the way a building ages when it's loved versus when it's merely maintained." I said, "The argument is that something in the structure responds differently to care than to upkeep." She said, "I'm not sure I believe it's entirely literal, but I understand the metaphor." I said, "What do you think the metaphor means?" She looked at me for a moment. She said, "I think it means that some things need more than functional maintenance. They need someone who is interested in what they actually are, not just what they can be used for." I opened the door wider and she came in. We ate at the kitchen table in the gray November morning light, and the bakery things were exactly the right ones. And afterward, she read something on her phone while I made more coffee. And the apartment felt in the simplest and most uncomplicated way, like a place where 2 people who were comfortable with each other were spending a Saturday morning without anything being required of either of them. When she left, she stood in the doorway with her jacket on and said, "Next Saturday, if you're free." I said, "I'm free." She said, "Good." And that was that. The shape of things settling naturally into the shape they had always been moving toward. Dara came to visit in the second week of November. She had called twice since the birthday party, and I had deflected both times. Honestly, I was still reorganizing the interior furniture of my life and needed the space to do it properly. She had waited until she could wait no more. She arrived on a Saturday with a bag and good wine and the particular energy of a woman who had gotten on a plane to check on her friend and was determined to be useful. We spent the afternoon on ordinary things. She helped me choose a rug for the hallway, which I had been avoiding deciding on for weeks, and had lunch at a place on the corner and walked along the water in the November cold. I told her about Thea over lunch, not strategically. Thea had simply become part of the ordinary narrative of the past month and appeared in it the way she appeared in everything as the constant around which the other things organized. Dara listened with friendly, total attention. When I finished, she said, "How long has she been this way with you?" I said, 4 years, she told me. "Since before the marriage became what it became." Dara said, "And you didn't see it." I said, "I saw something. I filed it under Thea is very good at caring for people." Dara said, "Which is technically accurate." "It is," I said. "It just isn't complete." She said, "What does it feel like now, when you look at her?" I thought about it carefully. I said, "Like I have been looking at something peripheral for a long time and I just turned to face it directly, and it is not surprising. It is more like recognizing, like something I already knew but in a different language." Dara was quiet for a moment. She said, "You know what that sounds like?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Just making sure." At some point, I said, "Thea is coming for dinner tonight." Dara said, "Good." "Just good?" I said. She smiled. "Just good. I'll get to see her properly." Thea arrived at 7 with a warm bottle of red wine and a small pond herb from the market basil this time, different from the first one she had brought, and she had selected it with the specific deliberateness she brought to gifts, which was that she never gave the same thing twice and always gave something that had a use rather than just a meaning. The herb would grow on my windowsill alongside the first one. There would be 2 now. I was aware that this was not incidental, a different variety from the one already on my windowsill and her reading glasses in her jacket pocket, and the specific contained quality of a person who always arrives slightly more prepared than the occasion strictly requires. I watched Dara register these things. We ate around my kitchen table with the lamp on and the good wine and the herb sitting on the windowsill next to my grandmother's bowl, which it had joined naturally because Thea had placed it there without being asked. I watched Dara watch Thea explain the textile factory project with her hands and her very careful vocabulary. Thea did not perform expertise, she simply had it, and it came through in the quality of her attention to the problem and the specific precision of her words, the way she distinguished between what she knew and what she believed and what she was still working through. Dara, who had spent 15 years in corporate consulting and had therefore sat across the table from many experts, was watching with the expression of someone who recognized the real thing. I watched Dara's face do something quiet and conclusive. Thea stayed until 9. She washed the dishes while Dara and I sat at the table, moving to the sink and simply doing it, the small domestic claiming of a space that had been happening so gradually I had almost not registered it until now. Then she put on her jacket and kissed both of us on the cheek in the economical way she said goodbye to the people she was easy with, and left. She had mentioned in passing that the herb would do well if I kept it beside the bowl. The light was consistent there. She had noticed the bowl and the windowsill and their specific relationship to the east light over the course of multiple visits and had formed a horticultural opinion about them. This was Thea. This was the accumulated texture of the attention she had been paying for a very long time. She left. The apartment was quieter without her. Not emptier, it still had everything it had before, but quieter in the way that a room is quieter after the specific presence that was keeping the silence warm has stepped out of it. Dara sat for a moment. She was looking at the 2 herbs on the windowsill. She said, "You look at her like you've been practicing not to." I looked at the herbs. Dara said, "You've been looking at her like that all evening, and she's been looking at you like she's allowed exactly 2 seconds at a time before she has to look somewhere else." I said, "It's complicated." "I know it's complicated," Dara said. "I was there the night your husband announced your divorce at your birthday party. I understand the territory." "She's protecting me," I said. "She thinks I'm not fully ready." "Are you?" Dara asked. I thought about it honestly, the way I had been trying to think about things since October. About what I felt versus what I was responding to. about the careful distinction between comfort and desire, about the difference between someone being a refuge and someone being the actual destination. Close, I said. Very close. Dara said, she already knows you're close. How? Because, Dara said, she looks at you like she's been looking at you for years and knows every version of where you are. The question isn't whether you're almost ready. The question is whether you're ready for it to stop being almost. The herb sat on the windowsill in the lamplight next to my grandmother's bowl. Dara said, she's not going anywhere, but you should let her know she doesn't have to keep standing at the door. She went to bed. I sat at the kitchen table in the lamp's warmth and thought about doors and about the cost of standing at them and about what it would mean to open one properly. I was ready. Sitting in the kitchen with the lamp on and the November dark outside and the 2 herbs and the blue bowl, I understood that the thing Thea had been waiting for was not more time. It was more completeness, the demonstration that I was choosing her from a whole life and not as a passage out of a broken one. And the demonstration was ongoing in the best way. Every day I built the apartment back into something genuinely mine. Every day the divorce moved forward. Every day I made choices that were mine specifically, that had nothing to do with grief or response or reaching for something solid in unsteady water. Dara left on Sunday. Her exit line, standing in the doorway with her bag over her shoulder. When you're ready, she already is. Then she hugged me and went to her car, clean and precise and gone. That was Dara. November continued. Thea and I kept our Thursdays, though they had become something more porous than Thursdays, texts on Mondays, phone calls on Wednesday evenings, Saturday mornings at my kitchen table or hers. She was consulting on the textile factory alongside the post office follow-up, and she often brought her drawings to my table when she visited, because the light was good and I had a second chair and she had started bringing her work without making an announcement about it. The way a person gradually begins to live somewhere without asking permission. I watched her work sometimes. Not constantly. I had my own desk, my own spreadsheets and project timelines, but occasionally I looked up and there she was in the morning light, pencil moving across the drawings, coffee cooling in its usual position, the architectural cross-sections spread across her half of the table with the focused patience of someone who was genuinely interested in the problem in front of her rather than performing interest in it. There was a morning in the second week of November when she paused her work and looked up at the bowl on the windowsill and said, the counterclockwise stirring. I said, what about it? She said, I've been thinking about it since you told me. Why counterclockwise specifically? I've been trying to find the practical reason. I said, did you find one? She said, nothing structural, but I think some practices are correct because they feel correct and are performed faithfully, and the faithfulness becomes its own reason over time. I looked at her. She said, not everything load-bearing was designed to be. I went back to my spreadsheet and sat with that for a long time. I watched her work sometimes. Not constantly. I had my own desk, my own spreadsheets, but occasionally I looked up, and there she was in the morning light, pencil moving, coffee cooling, drawings spread across her half of the table, and I thought about the 7 years of kitchen doorways and borrowed socks that had led to this specific morning, and I was not sad about the length of the route. Hilda's lunch happened on a Tuesday, just the 2 of us, at a restaurant near the house that had been mine, and was now simply a building in a neighborhood I had formerly lived in. We talked for 2 hours about her garden and about the way families reorganize themselves around change, and about her belief that some relationships are structural in a way that doesn't require the official frame to hold them. She said, you and Thea have always been friends. I said, she has been very good to me. She said, she is good to the people she loves, but you specifically since the very first dinner. I watched her know where you were in every room, every time. I said, I didn't notice at the time. She said, I know, but I did. A pause over soup. She said, is she all right? And I said, yes. She's working on something she cares about. Hilda nodded. Good, she said. She works best when she's allowed to care, and she has been allowed to care about this one. I hope she knows she is allowed. I thought about that on the drive home. The specific phrasing of it. She is allowed. I called Thea that night instead of waiting for Thursday. She answered on the first ring. Are you okay? She asked. Yes, I said. I wanted to hear your voice. A pause. A real one. Okay, she said. You have it. I told her about the lunch with Hild. She listened without interrupting, which she always did. And when I finished, she said, she loves you. You know that. I know, I said. She said, she has been asking after you since the birthday. Not to manage things, because she genuinely wanted to know you were all right. I know, I said again. She told me she worries about who looks after you. A longer silence. She said, "What did you tell her?" I said, "I told her you were all right." She said, "That's true." I said, "Thea." "Yes?" "I need you to stop being all right as a default position," I said. "Not forever. Just start telling me when things are difficult. Because I want to know." A pause in which I could feel her deciding. She said, "I'll work on that." "Not work on it," I said. "Just do it." She said, "Is there a difference?" "With you there is," I said. A small sound that contained a laugh. "Noted?" she said. We talked for another hour. The textile factory, a book she had been reading, the lobby renovation at my building that I suspected was structurally unsound. She had opinions, precise and certain ones, and I listened to them lying on my sofa with the lamp off and the city light coming through the curtains, and understood that this was what I wanted. Not as a substitute, as the actual thing, the specific, irreplaceable thing. When we said goodnight, she said, "See you Thursday." And I said, "Yes." And then, "Thea." She said, "I know." I sat up. "What do you know?" She said, "I know where you are. I can hear it when we talk. You sound more like yourself than you did in October." I said, "How do you know what I sound like?" She said, "I have been listening to you for 6 years. I know every version." I said, "And which version is this?" She said, "The one that doesn't need anything from me that it isn't also prepared to give back. The version that shows up because it wants to and not because it has to. I have been waiting for that version since October, and I think tonight might be the first time I can hear it clearly." I said, "It is the first time. I wanted you to know." She said, "I know. Good night, Clem." I said, "Good night." I lay on the sofa for a long time after the call ended, looking at the city light through the curtains, and thought about 6 years' worth of listening and everything that had been received and held and waited for. She had been listening for 6 years. I had been speaking for 6 years without knowing she could hear all of it. The divorce was finalized in the 3rd week of November. Petra Calloway sent a document by email and a brief handwritten note that said, "Clean break. Well done." I set it beside my monitor with the sticky note about choosing, and for a moment the two of them sat together, and I thought about everything built in the space between the birthday and now, and understood that the building had been genuine and not compensatory, and that I knew the difference because I had been paying attention to the difference every single day. I texted Thea. "It's done." She wrote back, "How are you?" I wrote, "Clear." A single period. Then, "Dinner." "Not Thursday," I wrote. "Tonight." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes." We went to the warm amber place with the corner table. She was there before me, jacket over the chair, glasses in her pocket, wine already ordered. She stood when I came in, which she did not usually do, and I walked to the table and we looked at each other for one long moment in which a great deal was understood without being said. "Congratulations," she said, and she meant it the way congratulations means something when it comes from the exact right person. "Thank you," I said. We ordered. We ate. She told me the developer on the textile factory had pushed back on 2 recommendations which she had expected, and had answered with a supplementary document of such comprehensive specificity that the developer's architect had eventually simply stopped arguing. "You're formidable," I said. She looked up. "You always have been," I said. "I don't know why it took me this long to look at it directly instead of around it." She set her glass down. I said, "I'm not going to keep waiting." She looked at me. I said, "I know what you said about timing. I know what you were protecting. What I need you to know is that the thing you were protecting is intact. I'm not reaching for something because everything fell apart. Everything has been rebuilt. I am standing in my own life on my own terms, and I am looking at you with full information about who I am, and what I want is you. Not the idea of being saved and not the nearest available steadiness. You specifically. The post office windows and the east light and the coffee you leave to go cold and the drawings on my kitchen table and the socks that were too large that I never gave back." The corner of her mouth moved. "I still have them," I said. "I know," she said. I said, "When does the accounting period end?" She said, "I've been thinking about that. Have you reached a conclusion?" She looked at me, the gray-brown eyes and the full quality of her attention. She said, "The conclusion I keep returning to is that I was supposed to be waiting for you to be ready, and sometime in the past few weeks I realized that I am the one who needs a moment." I stared at her. "Not to change my mind," she said. "I need to be very clear about that. Not to reconsider. But I have been holding this for 4 years with both hands, and I need a moment to put it down and pick it up the right way. With both hands and no managing." I said, "That is the most Thea sentence you have ever said to me." Her mouth did the thing that was better than a smile. I said, Take the moment. She said, 1 week. I said, I've waited 4 years without knowing it. 1 week is nothing. She looked at me. She said, thank you. I said, the week starts tomorrow. She said, yes. We walked out into the cold. November had gone fully serious about its temperature, and our breath made small clouds, and Thea put her hands in her jacket pockets, and we stood on the pavement in the old version of this routine for the last time. I said, I'll see you in a week. She said, you'll hear from me before that. Why? She said, because I have been looking at you like I'm allowed 2 seconds at a time before I have to look somewhere else. And I need a week to practice looking longer. I stared at her. You talked to Dara, I said. She said, she texted me Sunday morning. I said, Dara is going to receive a strongly worded message. Thea said, Dara is very good at what she does. I said, which is? Thea said, she looks at the people you love and tells them what she sees. She walked to her car. I stood on the pavement watching her go, and I turned the word inside what she had just said over very carefully, and understood that with Thea, everything was deliberate, and that she had placed it exactly where she meant it to be. She texted on Monday, the factory wins. I wrote back, load bearing? She wrote, the whole structure. She called on Wednesday evening and said, I'm ready. Not to talk about it on the phone, but I want you to know. I said, the Heritage Board dinner is Friday. Come over after. She said, yes. The Heritage Board dinner was for the post office project. Thea was being recognized alongside the Heritage Group for the successful advocacy, which she had described to me with the understated discomfort of someone who was more comfortable doing good work than being publicly celebrated for it. She wore a dark blue suit I had not seen before, and her hair was pinned in the way she wore it for professional events, and she looked, as she always looked when she was doing work she believed in, like a person who is entirely in the right place at the right time. I went. She had not asked me to come. I had told her I was coming, which is a different thing. She found me in the crowd at the middle of the evening. She crossed the room in the economical, unhurried way she moved through spaces and stopped in front of me and looked at me with those gray-brown eyes. You came, she said. I said, obviously. She said, I didn't ask you to. I said, no. I came because I wanted to be here when you do something you're good at. I want to be present for those things. From now on, if that's all right with you. She held my gaze for a long moment. Then someone arrived to congratulate her, and she turned with graceful efficiency to receive it, genuine and deflective by turns, redirecting credit toward the Heritage Group whenever possible. I stood nearby and watched and felt something very simple and very clear. Not desire, which was also present, but something larger than desire. The specific feeling of a thing being exactly right. When the dinner wound down, she introduced me to 3 of the board members. She introduced me without hesitation, without the framing of former anything, without hedging the word that was now accurate and that she had clearly decided, in the week she had taken, was the one she was going to use from this point forward. The board members shook my hand and moved on, and Thea looked at me and I looked at her, and neither of us said anything because nothing needed to be said. The recognition was mutual and it was public, and it was, in its own quiet way, the first time that had been completely true in the open, and I felt it the way you feel the first real morning of a season that has finally come, not as surprise, but as the specific satisfaction of a thing being actually, definitionally here. The evening had been long and warm and genuinely good. Thea had moved through the room the way she always moved through rooms, and I had moved alongside her without either of us having to negotiate it. The board members had been friendly, and the food had been good, and Audra, the Heritage Group chairwoman, had shaken my hand at one point and said, "We're glad you came." Which was such a simple thing and so genuinely meant that I had nothing to say in return except so am I. We took separate cars because hers was already there and mine was already there, and I drove home in the dark with the heater on and the city moving around me and thought about load-bearing windows and the east light and 1 week and the words she had used. My apartment was warm. I had left the lamp on. The herbs were on the windowsill next to my grandmother's bowl, 6 weeks in now, both of them alive and actually slightly larger than when they had arrived, which felt like it meant something I was willing to be sentimental about. She knocked. I opened the door. She was in the dark blue suit and the pinned hair and the jacket still over her arm, and she was standing in my doorway the way she had stood in doorways for years, present, contained, the composure that was not armor but was the foundation underneath everything that was about to happen. I stepped back. She came in. The apartment smelled of the candle I had lit and the herbs and the cedar of her coat when she laid it over the chair. I said, "Do you want anything?" She said, "No." She set her bag down and stood in the center of my living room with her hands at her sides and looked at me with an expression I had been seeing versions of for 6 years and was only now seeing clearly, not the managed version, not the composed version, not the version that lived just inside the acceptable frame. The actual thing. 4 years of it. Finally permitted to exist in the room without a container. I said, "Tell me what you decided during the week." She said, "I decided that I have been standing at the door of something important for long enough, and that the standing had become its own kind of dishonesty, after a point. Not to you, to myself." I said, "What changed?" She said, "Nothing changed. Everything became clear. There is a difference." I said, "What became clear?" She said, "That you are not my brother's wife anymore, and you have not been running since October, and the life you are building is genuinely yours, and I have been in love with you for 4 years, and I would like to stop managing that and start living inside it. If you will let me." I crossed the room. I touched her face first, my palm against her jaw, warm skin, the specific physical reality of a person you have been not touching for months, finally allowed to exist under your hand. She went very still. Her eyes closed for 1 second, then opened. She said, "Clem." I said, "I know." I kissed her. Patient, unhurried, the way that only happens when you have waited long enough that the waiting has become its own form of knowledge, when what you are doing is not reaching but arriving. Her hand settled at my waist, steady and certain, like something finally coming to rest in the exact place it was always going to come to rest. All that restraint, finally turning into something honest instead of withheld. We stood in the lamplight for a long time. The herbs on the windowsill, the cross-section print on the wall, my grandmother's blue bowl catching the lamp's light in a way that turned it warmer than blue. She said, eventually, quietly, "I want to say it properly." I waited. She said, "I love you. I have loved you since the first Tuesday 6 years ago when I watched you make my mother laugh with a story about your worst job, and I thought, I am going to be in serious trouble with this one. I have been in trouble with this one ever since, and I managed the trouble with everything I had available to me, and I am finished managing it. You were always worth more than management." I said, "You could have told me." She said, "I couldn't. Not while you were with my brother, and not while you were married, and not when you were breaking. None of those were the right time." "When is the right time?" I asked. She said, "Now." I said, "Yes, now." She stayed. In the morning I woke up to the east light through the curtains I had chosen, and she was in the kitchen. I could hear the specific sound of her making coffee with the focused attention she brought to everything, the precise quiet of a person who knows where things are and uses them with care. She appeared in the doorway with 2 mugs, hair down, no jacket, no professional frame, no composed exterior that the morning had not yet assembled. Just herself in the morning light of my apartment, with coffee made correctly without being asked. She said, "The herbs need water." I said I was going to do it. She said, "I'll do it." She crossed to the windowsill and watered both of them with the small economy of motion she brought to everything, and then she came and sat on the edge of the bed and handed me the coffee, and we sat together in the east light and did not say anything for a while. The city moved outside. The light changed slowly across the floor. Finally I said, "Same time next week?" She looked at me. She said, "I was thinking something slightly more regular than once a week." I said, "How regular?" She said, "Daily, to start." I said, "That's very specific." She said, "I know what I want." I said, "Yes, you always have." She drank her coffee. The east light had reached the foot of the bed. The herbs on the windowsill were catching it in the way they caught it every morning, which I had been watching for months now in the particular way you watch something you have decided to keep track of. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. I said, "Tell me something you've been not saying." She looked at me. She said, "I've been not saying a great many things for a very long time." I said, "Pick one." She thought for a moment. She looked at the herbs. She said, "I have been bringing you plants because I wanted something of mine to be growing in your apartment, not as a statement, just because I wanted it." I said, "I know." She said, "I know you know." I said, "Tell me another." She said, "I have been planning our Thursdays since the Sunday before. Every week." I said, "Me too." She said, "I know that too." I said, "Tell me the one you've held longest." She looked at the bowl on the windowsill, the blue ceramic catching the east light. She said, "I have loved you since before I had a name for it. And having the name for it changed nothing, except that I knew what I was holding." I said, "And now?" She said, "Now I am no longer only holding it." She drank her coffee. 2 weeks later, we attended Hilda's birthday dinner together. Not strategically, Hilda had invited us both separately, and I had called Thea and said, "Should we go together?" And she had said, "Yes." And that had been the entire conversation. Both words. One question, one answer. We arrived at Hilda's house warm, full of cooking smells, the particular texture of a home that has been genuinely lived in for decades. The walls marked with the quiet evidence of children and meals and years. The family was there in its current reorganized configuration. Luca was there with Frida, who was quiet and composed and shook my hand with the straightforward dignity of someone who understood the history and had decided that grace was the only acceptable path through it. Luca and I spoke briefly, civilly. He looked well, lighter than he had in years, which was information I received without resentment and without making it complicated, because it confirmed what I had known for a while, that we had been wrong for each other in correctable and specific ways, and the correction had been painful but not wrong, and both of us were better for it. Thea moved through the house the way she always moved through family gatherings, present, available, the steady organizing presence that the room arranged itself around without requiring her to announce herself. The difference was that now, when I looked up from wherever I was in the room, I found her. And when she looked up, she found me. And neither of us looked away first. The room understood this without requiring an explanation, which was the best possible version of a public moment, the kind where the truth simply exists and nobody has to manage it. Hilda found me in the kitchen before dinner. She took both my hands in hers, which was her specific form of emphasis, and looked at me for a long moment. She said just, "Good." Just the word, with everything she meant by it in her face and her hands. "Good," I said back. She squeezed my hands and returned to the stove. After dinner, Thea and I walked to our cars together in the late November dark. The night was cold and clear, the kind of clear that arrives when the cloud cover breaks and the stars are fully visible, and the cold has a quality that feels almost generous in its honesty. She pulled her coat around her, and we walked the length of the driveway in the dark without talking. At the cars, she turned to face me. She said, "You didn't flinch, all evening." I said, "No." She said, "Not when you spoke to Luca, not when Hilda gave the toast, not once the whole evening." I said, "It didn't ask me to. None of it was frightening." She said, "What was it?" I thought about it. I said, "Ordinary, good ordinary." She looked at me in the cold, clear dark. 4 years and a birthday party and a barefoot drive home and a spare room and load-bearing windows and almost there and the morning coffee and the daily promise and the words she had used at the Heritage Board dinner. She said, "You didn't look like someone at a difficult event. You looked like someone who had come to a family dinner." I said, "That is what I came to." She said, "I know, I was watching." I said, "I know you were watching. I've always been able to feel it." She was quiet for a moment. I said, "I told you I was looking." She said, "You did." I said, "I'm still looking." She said, "I know. I am too. I think I'm going to be doing it for a long time." She kissed me in the driveway of the house she had grown up in the cold November air, briefly and completely, and then she stepped back and put her hands back in her pockets and said, "Drive safe." And I said, "You too." And she said, "Daily. Starting tomorrow." And I said, "Yes." And that was that. The cleanest ending to the longest beginning I had ever lived inside, and the most honest one, and the only one that was entirely mine from beginning to end. I drove home. I went up to my apartment. The lamp was on. The herbs on the windowsill, my grandmother's blue bowl beside them, the cross-section print on the wall, all the things I had chosen or been given or borrowed and kept because they were the right things in the right places. The borrowed socks were in the drawer where I had kept them since October, laundered and folded. Too large. Exactly right. I was going to tell her about the socks in the morning. I was going to say, I kept them, since the beginning, the ones that were too large, and she was going to look at me with those gray-brown eyes, and the corner of her mouth was going to do the thing it did, the half-millimeter that was better than a full smile, and it was going to be the most ordinary and the most specific conversation in the world. And then she was going to pour the coffee correctly, and I was going to tell her about something that had happened at work, and she was going to have an opinion about the structural element of the problem, and the herb on the windowsill was going to catch the east light, and my grandmother's bowl was going to catch it too, and it was going to be a morning. Just a morning. The first of many. I was going to tell her about the socks in the morning. I was going to say, I kept them, since the beginning, and she was going to look at me with those gray-brown eyes and do the thing with the corner of her mouth that was better than a smile, and it was going to be the most ordinary and the most specific conversation in the world, and I was going to be present for every word of it. I turned off the lamp. The city light came through the curtains. The apartment held the warmth of an evening that had been many things. The dinner, the cold driveway, the drive home, the lamp, the herbs, her coat on the chair, the coffee in the morning, the east light and the blue bowl and the two small growing things on the windowsill that she had planted there one at a time over the course of 2 months without announcing that this was what she was doing. I lay in the dark and thought about the 7 years it had taken, and the ways in which 7 years was exactly the right amount of time, not too long and not wasted and not unjust, but exactly the length of a process that required the specific sequence of events it had required. The marriage and its ending, the birthday party, the barefoot drive home, the 3 days in the spare room, the 10 days, the dinner, the sofa, almost there. Daily, she had said, starting tomorrow. I turned off the lamp. The city light came through the curtains. Tomorrow, daily. I thought about 6 years of kitchen doorways and the specific warmth of a borrowed room at the end of a birthday that had gone another way entirely. I thought about counterclockwise stirring and load-bearing windows and the way east light looks when it comes through a window you chose yourself and lands on a bowl that belonged to someone you loved who is gone but is not. Not entirely. Because the bowl is still there and you are still using it, and someone has noticed that you use it and has been paying attention to what it means. I thought about all of it in the dark of the apartment with the lamp off and the city light coming through the curtains. Then I stopped thinking about it and simply lived in it instead. It was enough. It was, actually, precisely enough. And she already knew about the socks, she had said so, which meant she had known since October that I had kept them and had chosen not to mention it, and had let me carry the small private fact of it until I was ready to say it out loud. That was also Thea. That had always been Thea.